Hello, I'm Jim Leaviss from M&G Prudential, and I'm here today with well-known financial writer Frances Coppola to talk about her great new book, The Case for People's Quantitative Easing. Hello, Frances.
Hi.
Now, we're quite a long way into the quantitative easing process. It's a decade really since it started. The process then was the central bank buying government bonds in trillions and trillions in the US, in the UK, the ECB, Bank of Japan, and now as we are today, it looks like the ECB is about to restart this. On some academic surveys, it looks like QE does work. It reduces bond yields. They say it increases inflation, increases growth, reduces the cost of borrowing and causes people to buy more risky assets to stimulate the economy. You would argue, though, that that sort of QE isn't the right sort of QE. So what exactly is the case for people's quantitative easing?
Well, it's not quite true to say that I think it's the wrong sort of QE. It's more that it's not broad enough. So here we are saying that the solution to our problems is to prop up asset prices as if we are in the kind of deflationary spiral that we were immediately after the 2008 financial crisis. But actually that's not our problem. Our problem now, broadly speaking, is that people don't have enough money. So it's all very well raising asset prices for people who have assets, but if ordinary people don't have money, then you aren't going to be able to raise aggregate demand. And our problem at the moment is that we have an aggregate demand problem. People aren't spending enough.
So the QE did the wrong sort of thing. It increased inequality because it boosted wealth for those who had a lot of money, but those who didn't have money didn't have any extra spending power.
I would say so, yeah. We focus too much upon supporting wealth, really, and not enough on supporting aggregate demand directly. We kind of assumed that if we supported wealth, if we propped up asset prices, then that would trickle down, to use a phrase, into increased spending, aggregate demand in the economy, increased spending. That would mean more activity in the economy, more purchases, more businesses hiring. It would just sort of generally raise the whole level of economic activity. We've done an awful lot of QE, and we have economies that are, broadly speaking, still on the floor, with the possible exception of the United States, where they've done something a little more direct. So my argument is that we could have had something much more vibrant sooner if we'd done it differently.
And how does this form of people's QE differ from a traditional Keynesian fiscal expansion, or indeed perhaps a very fashionable new branch of economics that's going on at the moment, MMT, modern money theory, which is a kind of printing money theory that people argue about the minutiae of what it actually means. But how does this differ from those two branches of economics?
I think the important thing is that when we're doing fiscal expansion and so forth, what we're trying to do is, in a way, change the economy over the longer term. We're trying to achieve some kind of major redistribution. We're trying to support one part of the economy and maybe damp down another. It's a different function from saying we have a demand problem. People across the board haven't got enough money, therefore we need to give a short-term, a temporary boost to raise people's spending power simply by creating more money and giving it to them. Now, obviously the government could do that by deficit spending, but hey, we have a central bank. Why not do it directly?
Okay, then let's talk about the two types of people's QE discussed in the book. Type 1 you call give the people the money. Is this a helicopter drop? Is this the famous helicopter flying over towns and dropping banknotes out of it, or the Keynes' idea of people digging up bottles full of banknotes? Is that what you mean by this?
Well, particularly the helicopter drop. Milton Friedman's famous image of a helicopter hovering over a town and dropping banknotes from the skies. And these days, of course, our helicopters are electronic, so we wouldn't be dropping banknotes, we would be putting money into people's bank accounts. But it's that kind of idea that you could simply create some money and give it to people, and that those people might do all manner of things with it, but sufficient of them will spend it to raise your aggregate demand, get your economy moving. I think Keynes' idea was slightly different because people actually had to do some work for the money. They physically had to dig up the bottles, so it was more like a job guarantee. But no, it's still a kind of create money, it's just that people had to put a bit more effort in, but it's still the same kind of idea. That's saying your problem is you haven't got enough money, and if your problem is that you haven't got enough money, then you need to create money and give it to people.
Do you worry on this point that we already have a very consumption-driven economy, and giving people money to go and spend it on the high street is just perpetuating that kind of economy rather than more useful kinds of economic activity.
Well, I think this kind of ties back into what we were discussing before about the difference between what I would call people's QE, helicopter money, and fiscal policy. If you were doing this as a fiscal expansion, you might say, actually, I don't want to encourage people to buy more stuff. I want to use the money to reduce rents or enable people to save for their old age. There's all manner of things I might want them to do with the money. Fiscal policy tends to be much more directed in that way in terms of rebalancing society. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think when you have an immediate problem of aggregate demand, you're in a slump, you need to do something literally quickly just to boost it up. But that needs to be coupled with other things as well.
Okay, so that was type 1. Type 2 was economic rebalancing, this kind of structural reform argument. How about that one?
This is one that gets quite a lot of credence in a lot of circles, which is the idea that the central bank can backstop the long-term fiscal expansion, perhaps investment in infrastructure or in green finance, green initiatives, renewables, in order to rebalance the economy over the long term, and that the government can do it either by borrowing directly from the central bank, which some people argue, this is the MMT argument, or they can do it by issuing bonds which the central bank would buy. And there's quite a lot of merit in that argument. I have a slight caveat about it, which is like if your government is directing the central bank to buy bonds or to finance it, then we do have a question over how much control the central bank can exercise over inflation.
Well, that's probably quite a nice place to end in that case, because let's talk about the real world, because there have been some experiments, successful or unsuccessful, around the world in this sort of thing. I mean, you might say that Australia did an experiment with a kind of helicopter drop, Italy too, and maybe you can touch on those, but also experiments with money printing to give away. You might look at Zimbabwe, Venezuela, or Weimar Germany at the hyperinflationary ends. How do you stop being Zimbabwe, and what were the kind of outcomes of some of these real-world trials of helicopter money that we may have seen?
It's very interesting as to what the outcome is when you use it and under what circumstances and how you construct it. So, for example, if we look at Australia's fiscal drop, it was not strictly helicopter money because it was the government that dropped it, gave away a sum of money to all of its citizens in the aftermath of the financial crisis. It didn't cause hyperinflation, it didn't cause any sort of inflation, but it did give the economy a bit of a short-term boost. And importantly, a significant proportion of those people spent the money. They did things like going on holiday and buying new washing machines and things like that, all of which helps to boost your economy. And it didn't have any inflationary consequences at all, but it was, of course, in the aftermath of a really bad negative economic shock, which actually would tend to make the place deflationary rather than inflationary. So it could be argued that it did raise inflation, but in a good way. The problem you have when you get to places like Weimar, I think, is that that sort of hyperinflation is almost always, I think just about always, associated with a major drop in production. When you don't have enough production to mop up the money you're creating, you will have inflation. And it's that, I think, that scares everybody. They look at helicopter money and the possibility that it might even be directed by politicians, which in the book I do argue that there needs to be cooperation between elected politicians and central bank to do helicopter money, and think it'll be out of control, it won't relate in any way to the ability of the real economy to mop up the money, and we will have inflation or even hyperinflation. It is a risk. For our Western economies, I think it's a very small risk. And the reason for that is that actually when you're out of control like that, A, you've got a very badly damaged supply side, and B, you've got a basket case government. The important thing is that you have responsible government.
Excellent, thank you very much. Very timely book, given that it looks as if the global economy is going through a soft patch again, and the traditional tools of QE are being discussed. So this is The Case for People's Quantitative Easing by Frances Coppola, out now. Get it, it's a great read. Thank you very much, Frances.